I'm Rob, been using Python about 8 years, I guess, and I put that I'm a Python stinker. So I'll go ahead with the talk. I'm going to talk about virtual environments, which if you've been here before, I'm sure you've heard us talk about it before, or if you've been around Python at all. What a virtual environment does is it lets you keep your packages for a particular purpose isolated in one directory. The usual reason you hear for doing that is if you want to have multiple applications on a machine that have different requirements, like especially different versions of the same package. There's no way to really do that in a single directory, so virtual environments allow you to do whatever you want. But a couple other reasons why you might want to use them, especially if you're using Linux, a lot of the system utilities are written in Python. And just for various other reasons, you usually don't want to go scribbling all over your system's site packages, which is where Python installs things, third-party things that you grab. So it's best to just leave the operating system's directory, which in the case of OS X, that would be, if you look in library, I think it's Python site packages. So this is the stock OS X directory, and if I were to just install something outside of any virtual environment, it would end up here.
Rob, can you make the text a little bit bigger on the screen?
Yeah, I will try. Okay, more. And then another reason, one that I use it for a lot, is to just try out a new package that might be complete garbage, and you don't want to necessarily install it. And because usually when you're installing a package, you're not just installing that package, it's going to go grab, it could grab a couple dozen more packages, and unwinding that, getting rid of all that when it's mixed in with all your other stuff would be pretty difficult. But if you just put it in a brand new empty environment, if you don't like it, you just get rid of the whole thing. You don't have to worry about it. So I'm going to do some of this in Bash just because that's kind of what they assume you're going to use. But I normally use ZSH. There's no reason why you have to change your shell for this. But very basic getting started. If you've installed it, the one exception to installing things into your system level site packages is that you probably do want to install virtual env itself, and you'll see I have a few other things here, but I'll talk about that later. So I've got virtual env installed, which gives me this command, which is just virtual env, and if I just type that and then a space and then whatever I want to call it, what it'll do is in the current directory, which is just my home directory now, it created this this new folder, and in that folder you'll see a bin directory and a lib directory. Anything I install is going to end up in this. Sorry, Bash does not read my mind like ZSH. Anything I install third party is going to end up in here rather than in the system-wide directory, and then any scripts that come along with that package will be in this bin directory here, which right now should just contain like Python and pip and a couple other things. So one of the things you see here is activate. So that's a handy shell script that they include. I don't know if it counts as a shell script if you have to do it this way, but if you run this activate script, because right now you'll see if I type Python, what I'm running here, maybe this would be a better example. That's my my system Python there. If I run this activate script, sorry, Bash is going to be a little slower. Where am I? Oh, that's why. Now what? Am I still? Oh, again, does not read my mind. Now, what you'll see here that now my prompt has been prefixed with the name of the environment I'm in. That's just like a handy thing to let you know you're not, when you run Python, you're not going to get your normal Python. So now if I were to do this, you see that the path here has changed. The same is true for pip, which is what you're going to use to install things. So now if I pip install something, like say I want to try out this HTTP that I've heard so much about, it went out and grabbed it, but because I ran the copy of pip in the virtual environment, that is where it installed everything. That's it, lib. So now you see in here requests, which is one of the dependencies, pigments, HTTP, and the scripts that came along with that are also going to be in the bin directory for that environment. So before, I'm sure you didn't memorize the previous output, but HTTP and pigmentize, those are new. And now they should be in the path, and you can just run those commands. Basically, all activate and deactivate do is they, like if I run activate again, you see here in my path, the very first thing is now the bin directory for the virtual environment. So anything you run, Python, pip, et cetera, it prefers that copy. And then when you deactivate, my path goes back to normal. And that virtual environment doesn't appear in there anywhere. Something that you don't hear talked about a lot is that you don't have to activate a virtual environment to use it. In fact, I often don't. So I could do the same thing if I just did, if I just explicitly use the path to this Python or this pip, then I'm operating inside the virtual environment just the same as if I had activated it. So like, well, hopefully this doesn't take forever, but if I install something there, but now I'm not in the virtual environment, I'm just gonna run Python. Like we know requests was in there, but it's not here because this is my normal Python. So it did go into the virtual environment, even though I didn't activate it first. So that's kind of handy to know. You do not have to use the default version of Python on your system, which in this case is 2.7. If I wanted to, I'm gonna get rid of bash now. If I wanted to create a virtual environment that's using Python 3, you can just pass it -p, and then the path to the Python executable you want to use. So it could be an older version, could be a newer version. So I'll do this. And now if I run testing bin Python, you'll see that that's 351. Whereas if I just run the regular system Python, it's 2.7. And that acts just like the other one we saw where you can install things in there if they support Python 3, of course.
You have to have a non-default version of Python installed system-wide.
What's that?
You have to have a non-default version
Yes.
of Python installed.
Yeah, because you give it the path to another executable other than the default. So that has to be installed somewhere. It doesn't have to be in your path necessarily. So that's just the stock virtual environment support. There are a lot of tools built up around this, and the only one I'm going to spend much time on is called Virtual Env Wrapper, which is basically just a shell script, and you can have it run as part of your login process. And what it'll do is add a few more commands to your path that make dealing with virtual environments easier. So what it does is it gives you lots of commands, like you can do this make virtual env, which I know it doesn't seem any easier, but when I do this, we'll make one called IndiePie. It looks the same, but it keeps all your virtual environments in one place. So whereas virtual env will put it in the current directory wherever you are, if you use virtual env wrapper, you can keep all your virtual environments sort of squirreled away in one directory, and not have to necessarily clutter up your home directory or wherever else you happen to be. So there's make virtual env, there's rm virtual env, which without any prompting at all will quickly just get rid of it. Oh, well, I'm in it now. You see over here on the right, this is shell customization, but it'll tell me which virtual environment I am currently using. And since I'm in that one, it's not going to let me delete it. But if I do that, you can get rid of it. There's ls virtual env, which will list all the ones you have created. Although I never use that, I always just do work on, which also is part of virtual env wrapper. If you just type work on with no arguments, it'll list all the available environments. It also will set up shell completion. So if I just type work on and then the name, a couple letters of one that I have, I can switch. It also has this concept of projects where in addition to the virtual environment, I can tell it what directory, like if I'm working on a specific thing, I can say, okay, I've got the virtual environment here. That's where I want you to install all the Python packages. But then the actual files that I'm going to be creating myself, all the scripts I'm going to write, I want to keep them in this project directory. You can tell it, and you can either do make project and then the name of a folder, or you can, there's a way to take an existing virtual environment and tell it where the project directory is. Don't need to get into all that detail, but this is really handy if, because you can just quickly switch between things with this work on command. And if I do, if I'm in one now and I go to the other one, it automatically deactivates that one and activates this one. So it just takes away a lot of the sort of repetitive overhead. There's some CD commands like CD project, which actually let me switch back. So if I had gone to some far-flung directory and I wanted to get back, CD project will just take you back to your directory. If you wanted to get into the actual virtual environment for some reason and dig in there, CD virtual env will take you there. CD virtual env, you can also give it subdirectories. So if I wanted to go directly into like the bin directory inside the virtual environment, I could just do that. So it's just a big time saver. And one of the other features it gives you are pre-activate and post-activate scripts. So if you want to do a specific thing, every time I switch to this project, I want you to do some setup, or every time I switch away from this project, do some setup, and that's typically where your prompt customization happens. But it's just a shell script. You can do anything you want in there. So some of the ways I use virtual env every day, I don't know if you noticed in my path, I've got these two here. There's this tools 3 and tools directories. Both of these are virtual environments. And what they are just mostly command line utilities that I always want to have access to without having to switch to the environment where they're installed first to run them. Like, I don't have to type work on tools or whatever. I mean, I could, but by putting these in my path, I can always run things that are in there. So like something like glances, which is like a system monitoring utility there, or HTPy, which we saw before. I mean, whatever you want, IPython, any sort of utility that you rely on and don't want to have to switch to a virtual environment first every time you use it. Yeah, so what I did was I just did like make virtual env tools, which I can show here. I've got tools and tools 3. Tools 3 is anything that's Python 3 compatible. I'll put it in there. And then anything that hasn't been updated yet, I'll put it in the regular tools directory. So you can see what's installed there. The vast majority of these things are just dependencies for the stuff I actually want to use, like PEP8, Flake8. I think most of what I use is Python 3 compatible. But yeah, like I said, you don't have to activate the virtual environment to use the things in there, and that's what I'm taking advantage of here. I create the virtual environment, and then I can deactivate it after I've installed whatever I want. Then just by putting its bin directory in my path, I always have access to those commands without junking up any system bin directories. And if I ever don't want that, I can just blow away the whole thing. Another trick I use, this is TextMate specific. I don't know if anybody uses TextMate really, but I gotta get rid of this guy. But by default, so by default, when you run a Python script, you can just hit Command R to run a Python script in TextMate, and it'll use your system Python or whatever this variable points to. But it supports a TM project file. Well, I don't have my terminal up anymore, but you can, if you're working on a project in your editor and it depends on a particular virtual environment with specific Python packages in it, you can just set this TM Python in the project's directory itself in TM properties, and it'll use that version of Python to run all your commands, and then suddenly you won't get import errors. Something I would definitely check out is the Hitchhiker's Guide to Python. I mean, just in general, but they have a section on virtual environments that covers most of what I have talked about here. But I highly recommend it because it just kind of walks you through the same things I did, especially since I did not have time to make any slides. They're kind of doing a lot of the same things.
Hey Rob, could you say a few words kind of about the hierarchy of, like you talked about the system kind of stuff, and then the notion of whatever package manager, like if you're using Homebrew or Port, and then you've got pip, and then you get virtual environments where you can end up, obviously messing with systems verboten, but on like the Homebrew side, you could bring in stuff that gets shared by everything. Do you kind of have a guideline of like what the granularity is that where you want to install things, and kind of say, I use this all the time, I'm we use the package manager to put it in. Whereas these things are going to be just project specific, and they're obviously pip installed in the virtual environment. How do you have kind of a internal best practices that kind of guide you?
Well, I think in the initial step, it's kind of a judgment call. I think I've locked things up here somehow.
I can't think of a time when a really good idea to use the package manager to install something that's pure Python, like a module for Python. The only exception to that would be something like with like C extensions in it, like a Python imaging or and even in those cases, as long as you've got the right dependencies already in your system, you probably still want to use pip to install those things.
Or are you using pip installed in your local Python packages? Or
If you want to strictly write package manager, or does that also?
Well, that's like NumPy, which I use all the time in Canvas. It's like, I put those in with the package manager because it's like, no point replicating those to all the virtual environments that we're going to be creating, and they're not tiny.
For which package manager do you use? Do you use the system or do you use that?
No, I use Port to install, to build all of the things, which don't use any of the system things, because like I said, that's verboten. But for things, you can install NumPy from that, or you could actually pip install it, although fingers may come off hands if you did that.
I use Conda to be able to manage those dependencies for anything that has a C dependency, NumPy, Pillow, for example. If you use Conda for it, it makes managing C dependencies much easier, and it can also get around deployment problems on Heroku by using the Conda build pack as opposed to the Python build pack. Anything, but it manages them out separately. It's not quite as convenient as the work-on one for it. But it leads into a problem that I'm having with it. Are you familiar with PyM to be able to manage the versions for it? Because if you
Yes.
I can't get it to play nice with RVM. Like it keeps contesting over the being first on the path. So I use RVM, the GVM for Go, and I've now had to switch over to Conda because I can't manage my versions very comfortably with PyM for it. Like, have you found a workaround for that?
Well, I don't use all those simultaneously. I've used PyEnv a little. I'll just talk about what that is.
Yeah, first thing you should say, as a beginner, just use pip until that becomes intolerable, and something else is better. Right?
Well, yeah, but the pip isn't going to help you get an old version of Python, if that's what.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. So what PyEnv is, so virtual environments or just pip, this is all dealing with installing like a third-party library for the version of Python that you already have, either because you installed it or because it came with the OS. PyEnv is designed to let you just install arbitrary versions of Python. So like if your system only has 2.7, but you want to experiment with Python 3 and you have an old project that requires 2.6 or something like that, you can use PyEnv to install those alternate versions of Python. And then optionally, well, highly recommended, also when you go create a virtual environment, you can tell it to use one of the Python executables from one of those other versions if you need to. I don't really use PyEnv that much because OS X has 2.6 on it already. I installed Python 3 with Homebrew. So really the only thing I'd ever needed it for was Python 2.4, which doesn't install cleanly at all. And if you look on the GitHub site, the developer said, well, I don't know why I would support such an old version of Python. So apparently he doesn't understand the purpose of his own project. I'll talk about just quickly what I have done, which is what everyone should do because, of course I'm right. But to keep a nice, clean system. So this is, like I said, the default OS X site packages, where if you run just Python, like user bin Python, the one that comes installed with the OS, and you try to import something, that's where it's going to look. In addition to a couple other places, but and you'll notice I have basically nothing in there other than what VirtualBox put in there without asking me. What? Yeah, yeah. So what I did, now this part I would say is optional, but just to keep this completely untouched, and because when you upgrade the OS, you don't really own this directory, and there's no guarantee that everything will stay the way it was. So what I did was use Homebrew, which is an OS 10 thing, to install Python 2 into, which puts it in user local. So when you see this here, my default, that's the version that was installed by Homebrew. And in there, this pip is also in user local bin, which was installed when I installed Python into Homebrew. If I look here, now you'll see a few more things, not as clean, but really all this is I installed virtual env wrapper, which you can do like so. You just pip install virtual, well, that's gonna take forever. But I just installed virtual env wrapper into my new version of Python that came with Homebrew, and then everything else that I've installed after that, I created a new virtual environment first and installed it in there. Even the stuff that I want all the time, that goes in the tools or the tools 3. Now that wouldn't help for something like, you say you want NumPy on every single project. It's not gonna help you with that because they are independent of each other.
Well, it's especially things that kind of link to other large standalone packages like Blast. You don't want to, it's like, I try to think, where is it going to minimally, because otherwise you're kind of cloning a lot, and disk is cheap.
And if you're
Version dependency can come.
if you control the system and you understand the consequences, I mean, there's no reason not to do that. But on a server, multiple users, or some production application, you probably wouldn't do that. But on a desktop machine that you control, I think that's fine.
So I know this is a matter of personal preference to some extent, but where do you keep your virtual environments versus project folders versus?
Yeah, so the default for for plain old virtual env, they go wherever you put them. So like into the current directory by default, but you can create them anywhere you want. Yeah, so for virtual env wrapper has this, it uses this environment variable called work on home. That's where I put mine, just because it's easier to read, and I don't like having, I'll explain the default first. The default, I think, is, which probably doesn't even exist on my system anymore, is in your home directory, a hidden directory called virtual envs, I think. Yeah, I don't have it anymore. But I know that that's going to get really big. I don't like to have dot files that are like 500 megabytes. So I put it in here. Plus, it's easier to navigate to in the Finder if you need to for any reason. But it's just whatever you set that environment variable to, when you run virtual env wrapper, it just uses the value of that to do all of its work. And then for projects, I mean, they can be anywhere, wherever you keep your projects now.
Back to the NumPy thing. Do you know if there's a way where you can use PyEnv, like out of your home directory, and then when you create virtual environments from the PyEnv Python binaries, when you create that virtual environment, can you say like, hey, look in the PyEnv site packages, and if it's not there, then use the one in the virtual environment. So you can kind of have your own
Right.
site packages.
Yeah, I don't know. You can, I think it used to sort of merge the system-wide packages, and a lot of you probably know this, but it used to take whatever was available system-wide, like installed with the OS, and then the stuff you put in the virtual environment. You could use both of those things. And there was an option, right, to turn that off. Now that's the default, where it no longer includes the site packages. So even if you have it installed system-wide, it won't be available unless you specifically say, I want to use the site packages also.
You could also manage that, like, since you could set your default on PyEnv for it, whatever you set the alias to the default on that environment for, as long as you turn the inheritance like back on for it, you can specify the one that you want and then be able to basically inherit those. Like I don't know how to put it in a better way than that, but I do it with Conda. I can't get PyEnv to work because of RVM.
But it has to be the site packages for that version of Python, right? You can't, I mean, you can pick a different version of Python, but you can't
Oh, I don't know.
pick some arbitrary directory to represent site packages, right? I've never heard of that being done, but I haven't looked at all the options.
The only thing that I think is symlinking, but that's it.
Yeah. Another thing that all of these tools support, pip, which is just the basic package manager, and virtualenv and virtualenv wrapper, all of them allow you to add like -r and then the name of a text file. And in that text file, you can just list a bunch of packages, and it'll go install those. So you could create the virtual environment and install all the stuff you want in it just in one step, if you wanted to. A lot of projects, especially if you're working on a team, there will be some requirements file that lists all the packages that project needs, and you can use that to make your environment look just like what everyone else is using.
Define one ZSH, bottom left-hand side of the screen.
One, so if I had, those are just different like windows in within this terminal. I have several windows, and so it's just, yeah, the tmux, and that's just the name of the current process. But you can also, if you want, you can give those nicer names that, if you're working on something specific in that window. You can also, like I did earlier, you can split one window into multiple panes.
This has nothing to do with Python, by the way. That's
No, it does
a
not.
different talk. I think the one that is Clayton is very good at giving. There is Clayton. Yeah.
What did I do?
Oh, Tmux.
Stuff house.
Tmux is awesome.
Any other questions?
So maybe this is one of the approaches you were discussing. I couldn't quite tell, but couldn't you do the same thing for global packages that you do for global executables and just install them in a virtual env and then add it to your Python path? Just like you're adding the executable virtual env.
Yeah, there is a Python path environment variable.
Add it to the global Python path and then
Yes,
and then either enable site packages in your virtual envs or add it to the Python path within your virtual envs.
yeah,
So,
yeah, and then it would. Mhm.
Or you could do the equivalent of activate and just do it globally, like add that directory within directory in your path. Whenever you type Python, just do the quote unquote right thing.
Any other questions?
So how do you usually, what's your approach to, when you deploy things on a server, what's your approach to do this whole thing? Typically on a server you have, of course, more than one, let's say, Python project, and each project has different dependencies. So what's your deployment strategy? How do you use virtual env and pip and requirements and all that? What's your general process?
Well, I mean, most of the stuff we're doing is Plone. It's using build out. So, but we do actually use virtual environments to install build out itself. But that's almost the only thing in there. And then we just run build out from there, with a specific version of Python. But if we did have multiple projects, I mean, I'm not sure what you're asking. I mean, you could just, they're completely isolated from each other, so you just would, in that case, I would use like just the regular virtual env probably, not virtual env wrapper. So you can sort of control where it goes and keep it with that. Okay, yeah, so that way you can keep the virtual environments directory close to or even inside where the actual application lives. That way, if you ever get rid of it, it's all in one place and easy to get rid of.
I tend to like to put a hidden directory inside my project
Mhm.
and just occasionally
Yeah. Yeah, that's what we usually do is we put it, what Clayton said is we put it actually inside the Git repository. We'll create a virtual environment called env, and our git ignore just always has env in it. So everything that's inside there does not get picked up by Git.